To the ghost of Ridge 447. The L96A1 rifle lay across Sergeant Marcus Whitefeather Sullivan's knees like a steel prayer, its barrel catching the pale dawn light filtering through the Afghan peaks. He had named it Dead Point during his first tour, not for its killing capacity, but for the moment of absolute stillness required before each shot, that microsecond where breath, heartbeat, and intention aligned into perfect clarity. Now, crouched behind a cluster of weathered rocks on Ridge 447, Sullivan watched 14 Taliban fighters moving up the slope below him, their voices carrying on the thin mountain air as they discussed the lone American sniper they had been hunting for 3 days. The irony wasn't lost on him. He could understand fragments of their Dari conversation, picked up during countless patrols through villages where children had once waved at his convoy. Sullivan had been separated from his squad during a botched reconnaissance mission 72 hours earlier. While his unit extracted under heavy fire, he remained behind to provide covering fire, then found himself cut off when insurgents flooded the valley. For 3 days, he had played a deadly game of cat and mouse across these peaks, using Dead Point to pick off individual fighters while staying mobile. The Taliban had grown increasingly frustrated, committing more resources to hunting this ghost who appeared from nowhere, took his shot, and vanished. But now, Sullivan faced a problem marksmanship alone couldn't solve. His ammunition was nearly exhausted, 7 rounds remaining, no spare clips. Below, 14 fighters methodically searched every crevice, moving in a coordinated sweep that would inevitably flush him from his position. His radio had been damaged in yesterday's firefight, leaving him unable to call for extraction. By every tactical calculation, he should withdraw deeper into the mountains, try to evade until rescue arrived. Instead, Sullivan made a decision that violated every principle of sniper doctrine he had ever learned. Rather than retreat, he would hold this ridge through something far more dangerous: psychological warfare executed with surgical precision. The first memory that surfaced was unexpected. His grandfather's weathered hands teaching him to whistle an old Irish tune on the porch of their Boston home. "Music carries further than you think, Marcus," the old man had said. "Sometimes it's not about the notes, it's about who's listening." Sullivan checked his watch. E8 had 30 hours. The Taliban fighters were spreading out, following blood trails from yesterday's engagement. Their leader, a bearded man with careful eyes, gestured to positions with practiced efficiency. These weren't the fanatic fighters from training videos. They moved like soldiers, talked like fathers worried about making it home. One fighter paused to adjust his boot, wincing slightly. Another shared water from a battered plastic bottle. Small human moments that complicated the clean narrative Sullivan had carried into these mountains. The enemy was supposed to be faceless, not men who got thirsty and worried about their feet. If I believe my eyes, Sullivan thought, do I betray everything I was taught? The morning air was thin and cold, carrying the scent of snow from higher peaks and something else. The smoke from distant cooking fires, where families were starting their day, unaware that death was negotiating with itself on the ridges above their homes. Sullivan adjusted his grip on Dead Point and prepared to transform 7 bullets into a war of minds. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. What would you remember more clearly, the weight of the rifle or the sound of enemy soldiers sharing water? The first shot came at 0847 hours. The Taliban pointman, a bearded fighter carrying an AK-47, dropped silently as Sullivan's bullet found its mark. But instead of the usual chaos that followed a sniper attack, Sullivan did something unprecedented in his training. He began to whistle. The low, haunting melody echoed off the rock faces, impossible to pinpoint but clearly audible to every fighter on the slope. It was his grandfather's tune, the one that had floated through summer evenings in Boston when the world was simpler and enemies existed only in history books. The remaining 13 insurgents dove for cover, their coordinated advance dissolving into confused shouting as they tried to locate the source of both the shot and the eerie melody. Sullivan had studied these fighters for days, learning their patterns, their leaders, their psychological tells. Many were local recruits, farmers and shepherds pressed into service, more familiar with village conflicts than military operations. The whistling was designed to exploit their growing unease about this supernatural sniper who seemed to control these mountains. In a land where stories of jinn and mountain spirits still held power, the distinction between tactical advantage and otherworldly intervention could blur dangerously. 6 rounds remaining. Sullivan waited 47 minutes before taking his second shot, targeting the insurgent leader who had been trying to rally his men for another advance. This time, he followed the shot with a different sound, the sharp crack of a stone thrown against distant rocks, creating the illusion of a second sniper position on the opposite ridge face. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. The Taliban fighters found themselves pinned down, not by overwhelming firepower, but by the terrifying possibility that they were surrounded by invisible enemies who could strike at will from any direction. "What am I becoming?" Sullivan wondered as he watched the men below scramble for inadequate cover. These weren't the monsters from briefing rooms. They were scared, confused, caught between duty and survival, just like any soldier. One fighter kept touching a small photograph tucked into his vest pocket. Another muttered what sounded like prayers. Sullivan's mind drifted to his own wallet, where a photo of his sister's wedding sat next to his military ID. She had been 8 months pregnant in that picture, glowing with the kind of happiness that made deployment seem both necessary and unbearable. He wondered if his nephew had been born yet, if there was a letter waiting for him at the forward operating base he might never see again. The Afghan sun climbed higher, turning the rocks into furnaces. Below, the Taliban fighters huddled in whatever shade they could find, afraid to move, afraid to retreat. Their leader kept trying to establish communication with someone, probably their own command, requesting support or guidance for dealing with this supernatural threat. Sullivan realized he was transforming his ammunition shortage into a weapon itself. Each shot became an event, carefully timed and choreographed for maximum psychological impact. He would fire, then throw his voice using techniques learned from a ventriloquist uncle, creating the impression of multiple shooters communicating across the valley. The irony was bitter. He was using childhood memories, family skills, intimate human knowledge to wage war against other people's brothers, fathers, sons. The rifle in his hands remained dead point, but the war had become something far more complex than the simple equations of target and trigger. As morning stretched toward afternoon, Sullivan could see the psychological toll mounting. What had begun as a confident manhunt was devolving into a terrifying ordeal where death seemed to come from the mountains themselves. How long can a man use his humanity as a weapon before it changes him forever? By 1400 hours, Sullivan had fired only 4 shots, but the psychological toll on the remaining Taliban fighters was devastating. What had begun as a confident manhunt had devolved into a terrifying ordeal where death seemed to come from the mountains themselves. The fighters huddled behind inadequate cover, afraid to move, afraid to retreat, trapped by their own fear and the growing legend of the ghost sniper who controlled Ridge 447. From his position, Sullivan could observe their mounting desperation. The leader, a man Sullivan had begun thinking of as the lieutenant, based on how the others deferred to him, kept checking his radio, his voice growing more strained with each transmission. Sullivan caught fragments, requests for air support, questions about withdrawal, increasingly desperate descriptions of their situation. "They're reporting a ghost," Sullivan realized. "Not a sniper, a ghost." The transformation of his tactical situation into supernatural horror would have been amusing if it weren't so effective. These men, trained in guerrilla warfare against the world's most advanced military, were being paralyzed by a combination of psychological manipulation and their own cultural fears. But observing their humanity up close was taking its toll on Sullivan too. During the long wait between shots, he watched the lieutenant distribute the last of their water among his men, taking none for himself. He saw a young fighter, probably no older than 20, clutch a string of prayer beads with hands that shook from more than adrenaline. They love their families too, Sullivan thought, remembering his grandfather's words from a different context. The hardest thing about war isn't hating your enemy, it's realizing he's just like you. 3 rounds remaining. Sullivan faced his most audacious gambit yet. With deliberate calculation, he stood briefly on a prominent rock outcropping, allowing the Taliban fighters to spot him before dropping back into cover. The psychological message was clear and chilling. He was so confident, so in control, that he could show himself to 14 armed enemies and disappear again at will. The reaction below was immediate panic. Shouting erupted in Dari and Pashto, voices overlapping in urgent conference. The lieutenant was trying to maintain order, but Sullivan could see doubt spreading through the group like infection. They had glimpsed their tormentor, a single American soldier who seemed to mock their superior numbers with casual contempt. What they couldn't see was Sullivan's own growing doubt. Each psychological victory felt increasingly hollow. He was winning this engagement, but at what cost to something essential in himself? The clean satisfaction of legitimate targets had been replaced by something more complex, the manipulation of fear, the exploitation of cultural vulnerabilities, the use of human psychology as ammunition. His final shot came at 16:47 hours, not aimed at a human target, but at a loose boulder positioned above the Taliban position. Sullivan had spent precious time during the siege calculating angles and trajectories, and his bullet struck the rock at precisely the right point to send it crashing down the slope, creating a thunderous avalanche of stone that sent the demoralized fighters scrambling for safety. As dust settled over Ridge 447, an extraordinary thing happened. The remaining Taliban fighters began to withdraw, not in organized retreat, but in genuine panic flight. They had been broken not by superior firepower, but by the psychological pressure of facing an opponent who seemed to bend the very landscape to his will. Sullivan watched them go, dead point, empty in his hands, and felt no triumph. Only the cold weight of understanding that he had discovered something about warfare that no training manual had prepared him for. Sometimes the most effective weapon was the enemy's own imagination. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. If victory feels this empty, what does defeat cost? The silence after the Taliban withdrawal was deeper than any Sullivan had experienced in 3 days of hunting. No voices carrying on the mountain air, no footsteps on loose shale, no radio chatter echoing off rock faces, just the whisper of wind through the peaks and the distant call of a hawk circling thermal currents high above Ridge 447. Sullivan remained in position for 2 hours after the last fighter disappeared into the valley's maze of ravines and boulder fields. Training demanded verification that the retreat wasn't tactical deception, but deeper instincts told him the men were truly gone. The psychological break had been complete. They wouldn't return to this haunted ground where a single American had made 14 fighters question their own reality. But as afternoon shadows stretched toward evening, Sullivan's tactical victory felt increasingly Pyrrhic. He inventoried his situation: no ammunition, damaged radio, no food for 18 hours, and rescue still at least a day away, assuming his unit could organize extraction. More troubling was the inventory of his inner state. the growing disconnect between the soldier he had been 3 days ago and whoever he was becoming on this ridge. The whistle tune kept returning to his lips unbidden, his grandfather's melody now permanently associated with psychological warfare. How would he explain that to the old man when he got home? How did you tell someone that their childhood gift had become a weapon for breaking enemy morale? "If I make it home," Sullivan corrected himself. The ridge that had become his fortress could easily become his tomb. Taliban fighters might be gone, but the Afghan mountains remained unforgiving to isolated soldiers. Temperature would drop below freezing after sunset. Without food, his body would begin consuming itself for energy. Dehydration was already causing mild hallucinations. Shadows that moved like men, sounds that might be helicopters or might be wind. He found himself talking to dead point, carrying on quiet conversations with the rifle that had defined his war. "We held them off, didn't we? 14 men with 7 bullets. The old man would appreciate the mathematics of that. Maximum result from minimum input." But the rifle remained silent, its empty chamber offering no comfort, no validation for tactics that felt increasingly foreign to the man who had carried it into these mountains. Sullivan realized he was mourning something. Not his ammunition or his tactical situation, but some essential part of himself that had died during the psychological warfare. The enemy had been men who shared water, who carried photographs, who prayed to the same God under different names. Breaking them hadn't required superior firepower. It had required understanding their humanity deeply enough to exploit it. The knowledge felt like a violation, not of them, but of something fundamental in Sullivan himself. As darkness approached, Sullivan prepared for what might be his final night on Ridge 447. He arranged his gear with ritual precision, checking and rechecking equipment that might mean the difference between survival and becoming another casualty statistic. The mountain cold was already seeping through his uniform, and he had no fire. The smoke would reveal his position to any remaining Taliban in the valley. But the cold was less troubling than the growing awareness that he had crossed some invisible line during the day's engagement. The psychological warfare had been effective precisely because it was honest. It had revealed uncomfortable truths about fear, culture, and human nature that existed on both sides of the conflict. Sullivan settled in for the night, dead point across his knees like a steel prayer, and wondered if the rescue team would recognize the soldier they extracted. The war had changed him in ways that had nothing to do with enemy bullets and everything to do with understanding exactly how fragile the line was between civilization and the primal fears that lived in every human heart. In the growing darkness, he began to whistle again, softly, unconsciously, his grandfather's tune floating across the empty ridge like a ghost's lament. What part of yourself would you sacrifice to survive? When Sullivan's rescue team finally reached his position 36 hours later, they found him still holding the ridge, dead point, cradled in his arms like a sacred relic. The extraction had been delayed by weather and Taliban activity in the surrounding valleys, but Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and his squad had pushed through to retrieve their missing sniper. "Jesus! Sully, we thought you were dead," Rodriguez said, crouching beside Sullivan's position. "The whole valley's been talking about the ghost on Ridge 447. Taliban fighters are saying one American held off an entire company." Sullivan looked up from where he had been maintaining watch, his eyes holding a distance that hadn't been there before the separation. 14 men, Sergeant. Not a company. 14 men ran from one sniper. 14 men ran from what they thought they were seeing. During the extraction, as the rescue team provided security and Sullivan gathered his gear, Rodriguez noticed something troubling. Sullivan kept returning to the empty rifle, checking and rechecking the weapon with an almost religious intensity. The other soldiers whispered among themselves. Their legendary sniper seemed different, marked by his time alone on the ridge in ways that went beyond physical exhaustion. "How'd you hold them off with no ammunition?" Corporal Martinez asked as they began moving toward the extraction point. Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, his eyes scanning the valley where the Taliban fighters had fled in panic flight. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is what people think they're facing, not what's actually there. The comment hung in the mountain air, like smoke from a distant fire, technically true but incomplete, suggesting depths of understanding that his squadmates weren't prepared to explore. What Sullivan didn't share was the central revelation that had come to him during the long night. The psychological warfare had worked not because the Taliban were inferior fighters, but because they were human beings with the same fundamental fears that lived in every soldier's heart. He had discovered something that contradicted everything he had been taught about the nature of the enemy. These weren't fanatic monsters incapable of doubt. They were men who could be broken by the same psychological pressures that could break anyone. The effectiveness of his tactics had revealed an uncomfortable truth about the universality of human vulnerability. But the deeper secret was more troubling. Sullivan had enjoyed it. The chess game aspect of psychological manipulation, the intellectual challenge of turning limited resources into strategic advantage, the godlike power of controlling enemy behavior through fear, it had been seductive in ways that pure marksmanship never was. Dead Point had always been about the moment of perfect stillness before the shot, that microsecond where breath, heartbeat and intention aligned. But on Ridge 447, Sullivan had discovered something beyond physical accuracy, the ability to create perfect stillness in the enemy's mind, that microsecond where fear and reality aligned into complete psychological paralysis. As they moved down the mountain toward the extraction point, Sullivan carried the weight of this knowledge like unexploded ordnance. How did you explain to a debriefer that you had held 14 men, with 7 bullets, not through superior tactics, but through the exploitation of shared human weakness? How did you report that the most effective warfare happened in the space between what people feared and what they believed? The rifle that had held 14 men with 7 bullets would become legend among both American forces and Taliban fighters, a reminder that in mountain warfare, the mind could be the most powerful weapon of all. But Sullivan knew the real lesson was darker. Understanding your enemy's humanity deeply enough could make you more effective at destroying it. The extraction helicopter waited in a clearing below, rotors turning, ready to carry him back to the forward operating base where he would file reports and receive commendations. But part of him would remain forever on Ridge 447, in that moment of perfect psychological warfare when he had learned exactly how much power lived in the space between perception and reality. Which is more dangerous, the enemy you can see or the one you've learned to understand? Years later, Sullivan would tell interviewers that the true power of Dead Point was never its accuracy, but its ability to create the perfect moment of stillness, not just in the sniper, but in the enemy's growing realization that they faced something beyond their understanding. But in the immediate aftermath of Ridge 447, Sullivan found himself struggling with a different kind of stillness, the quiet that followed understanding. The debriefing at Forward Operating Base Chapman was routine. Tactical situation, enemy strength, ammunition expended, psychological state of rescued personnel. Standard questions that couldn't accommodate the actual experience of learning to wage war with ghosts and childhood memories. Sergeant Sullivan demonstrated exceptional resourcefulness under pressure, Colonel Harrison noted in his report. His ability to hold a defensive position against superior numbers reflects the highest traditions of American marksmanship. The commendation would follow Sullivan home, along with a Purple Heart for minor wounds sustained during the initial firefight and a Bronze Star for valor under extraordinary circumstances. Clean awards for a complicated truth. The official record would never capture the moment when warfare became psychology, when the enemy became human, when victory required the weaponization of fear itself. 6 months after his return to Fort Bragg, Sullivan received a letter that changed everything. It came through Red Cross channels, one of those carefully monitored communications that sometimes flowed between combatants after conflicts ended. The writer identified himself as Lieutenant Ahmad, the Taliban commander who had led the search for the ghost sniper on Ridge 447. The letter was brief, written in careful English, describing the psychological impact of that day on his surviving men. 3 had requested transfer to non-combat roles, unable to reconcile their experience with their understanding of warfare. 2 had left military service entirely, returning to their villages with stories of a supernatural American who controlled the mountains themselves. But the letter's final paragraph haunted Sullivan. "I have told my son about you, Sergeant. Not as enemy, but as teacher. You showed us that war lives in mind before it lives in weapon. This is knowledge too dangerous for young men to carry, but too important for old men to forget." Sullivan never responded to the letter, but he kept it in the same wallet where his nephew's photo now sat next to his military ID. The boy had been born while Sullivan was missing on Ridge 447, a new life entering the world, while he was learning dark lessons about the old one. The nightmares came sporadically, not of violence, but of understanding. Dreams where he could see through enemy eyes, feel their fear, manipulate their terror with surgical precision. Sullivan would wake with his grandfather's whistle tune on his lips and the taste of mountain air in his mouth, knowing he carried knowledge that couldn't be easily shared or forgotten. His final tour in Afghanistan ended without incident. Sullivan requested transfer to training duties, teaching new snipers the technical aspects of marksmanship, while carefully avoiding the deeper lessons about psychological warfare. Some knowledge was too dangerous to pass along, too seductive in its power over human weakness. Dead Point remained in his locker at Fort Bragg, a steel prayer that had once held 14 men with 7 bullets. Sometimes, late at night in the barracks, Sullivan would visit the weapon and remember the moment when he had learned that the most effective warfare happened not between armies, but between one human heart and another. The rifle had taught him perfect stillness, but Ridge 447 had taught him something more profound, that understanding your enemy's humanity could make you both more effective and more dangerous than any weapon ever forged. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. What do you carry that's too dangerous to share, but too important to forget?